next speaker is Brian Clegg, who has written a number of books. He's a science writer who's written on people like Edward Muybridge and Roger Bacon. And he's going to talk to us about the legends and legacy of Dr. Mirabilis himself, Roger Bacon.
Thank you. I'm hoping the microphone's working, because you can't hear it very well. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. Not so well, okay. I should speak up a bit, see that's it. Any better? Right, okay, brilliant. I ought to stress straight away, as has been mentioned, that I'm not an academic, I'm a science writer, and I've come to this from a slightly different angle. The first book I ever wrote, back in 2001, at least the first science book, was a book called Light Years, on the sort of history of our understanding of light, sort of going right back to the ancients. And Roger Bacon featured in that, and I got so interested in him that I then wrote a book about Bacon himself. There's just a couple of points about Bacon I do want to make before I go much further. One is we're talking about somebody who approximately lived towards the main part of the 13th century, but we'll come back to the exact dates in a moment. I do want to, of course, stress we're not talking about Francis Bacon. The first time I mentioned to anybody I was writing a book about the 13th century friar Roger Bacon, a friend of mine said, but surely Bacon was Elizabethan. And I had to point out that it was not Francis Bacon, the politician and philosopher, and certainly not the 20th century painter. So as far as we're aware, there is no relationship between the two. They are not related in any way, Roger and Francis. The second point I really need to make, especially as there's a lot of people here who know a lot more about the history of science, I suspect, than I do, that actually it's not true what it says on the front of my book. He really definitely was not the first scientist. It's, if you like, a hook. It's a thing to get people interested. It's a talking point. However, having said that, there are certainly some characteristics about Roger Bacon I hope we'll discover that at least make you think that he was an early approximation to a scientist. Now, I use 4 points to say I think that he has some aspects of being a scientist. Specifically, he stressed the importance of mathematics to science over and over again, rather repetitively. He had an openness to sources in the sense that he wasn't saying all good sources have to be modern and Christian. He did stress the value of experiment. As we've already heard, the word experiment did not mean the same thing then. I'll come back to that a little later. And I think most interestingly in terms of Bacon, he had the urge to communicate, because as far as I'm concerned, you aren't a scientist if basically you just study something and keep it to yourself. That is not science. Science requires communication. And as we'll discover, if there's one thing Bacon really did want to do, it was to communicate. I ought to say by the very quickly that having said that, he would not appreciate communicating to a general audience. He very specifically supported the view that communication should be made only to those who are worthy of communication. You don't put good food in front of asses. And as such, he didn't want to communicate to the masses, but he certainly did want to communicate science. But certainly a lot of these things, for instance, could be applied to Robert Grosseteste, although I suggest that certainly his communication side was nowhere near as effective as Bacon's. Finally, I think it's important when we think about Bacon to consider the legend, and I will be spending a little more time on that than we perhaps had otherwise, because I think apart from the else, it's important in understanding the way we have come to regard medieval science, that the legend has got in the way, has transformed views in a number of ways through history, and I want to pick up on that. Certainly, a lot of what we know, in inverted commas, about Bacon in general knowledge is wrong because of the legends. So, for instance, Bacon certainly, unlike, I think, Umberto Eco suggests in The Name of the Rose, Bacon didn't invent spectacles, and he certainly didn't invent gunpowder, which a lot of people still put across as something that he did. So, we're looking back, 800 years or so, and things are pretty dim when we start to do so. I mentioned his birth date, 1214. It's actually a pretty vague and indirect date that we've got. In 1267, Bacon wrote this. He said, "I've laboured diligently in sciences and languages, and 40 years have passed since I first learned the alphabet." And that is the only source we have for saying that he was born, as far as I'm aware, in 1214. But basically by working back and saying, well, what he probably meant by that was a slightly metaphorical use of the term first learnt the alphabet as to when he went to Oxford. Typically matriculation was at 13, so we add him 40 years, we do a bit of quick sums, and we work out that he was born about 1214. If he'd been literal, if he meant when he literally first learnt the alphabet, so first started schooling, you could probably push that date forward a little, and he may well have been born about 1220. But we tend to stick to the 1214 date as an official one. Similarly, really, in terms of his origins, we don't know an awful lot. The fact is, the vast majority of information we have about Bacon was what he wrote, in which he wrote not much about himself, and one or two things that were written quite a lot later. The 15th century historian John Rouse said that he was born in Ilchester in Somerset. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing to corroborate that. And also there's a village in the Cotswolds near Stroud called Chalford. Well, it's a tiny bit Chalford, it's bigger things, Bisley. And they also claim that Bacon was born there, and as far as I'm aware, there is absolutely no documentary evidence of that at all. It's just legend says he was born there. So we're not sure where he was born, probably somewhere vaguely West Country-ish. But what is certain is that he went up to Oxford University, probably around 1230, depending upon that original date. And that the first thing he probably did when he got here was to have a haircut. And that's basically because to join the university you had to take minor orders in the church, which meant having a tonsure. And in fact, one of the first sort of establishments recorded opening for university use particularly was a barber's, because there was an awful lot of demand for cutting your hair. The Oxford that he came to obviously was very different to the Oxford today. There was no university in terms of buildings, there were no colleges. People were put up in boarding houses, and lectures took place in large rented rooms. There was no university per se as an established set of buildings. Bacon would have taken around 6 years to get his BA, because of course if he's starting about 13, as was typical, a lot of it actually is what we now think of schooling. It wasn't just a matter of doing what we think of a BA as being. And a few more years to become a magister, an MA, a master, licensed to teach in the university. He could then have spent another 8 years to get a Master of Theology, another 8 years to get a doctorate in theology, but there's no evidence that he did. Although he's often referred to as Doctor Mirabilis, one of these set of sort of complementary names that are given to a number of people from the period, there's no evidence he ever took a doctorate in practice. And he appears to have moved to Paris, where there was a lot of demand at the time, as we've heard, because they had not been teaching Aristotle, because Aristotle had been banned. Once that ban started loosening a bit, there was a lot of demand for Oxford masters who had the Aristotle, could go out there and teach about it. While he was there, he was only there a few years, but he appears to have met somebody called Peter of Maricourt, or Peter Peregrinus, who was somebody who had a strong influence on him. I think it's fair to say until that point he didn't show an awful lot of interest in the sciences, but this Peter Peregrinus seems to have pushed him in that direction. He wrote one of the first known treatises on magnetism, did Peter, and when Bacon returned to Oxford, he was obviously full of enthusiasm. We're talking roughly the 1240s by now, and he spent large sums of money, or he says he does, on books and kit. In fact, quite almost, shall we say, incredible sums of money, because he claims that he spent more than £2,000 on books and instruments and mathematical tables. Now, just to put that into context, at the time, a fairly substantial house would cost you £2 to £3. and he spent 2,000. It's very, very difficult to take money from this far back in time and actually say, what is it worth today? There are a number of ways of doing it, which give you sort of a range of feeling for what this value was of that 2,000. The lowest type of value you can give it is basically the equivalent purchasing power, which is probably about just under 2 million, 1.7, something like that. Probably more realistic is its sort of relationship to labour earnings, where it's more like 30 million. And if you really want to get excited, you can start comparing it to things like GDP per head, where it shoots up to about 71 million equivalent. And if you go for overall GDP, it actually takes it to 500 million. Now, I think that's over the top, but certainly we're talking a lot of money. So much so, frankly, he probably was exaggerating a bit. But having said that, he did have a penchant for, shall we say, writings that you really weren't supposed to be reading. Probably had to spend quite a lot for those, to get hold of those books that had been banned or otherwise were considered a bit dubious at the time. Now, running out of money as a result of all this spending seems to have been, or at least may have been, the reason why he joined the Franciscan order. And this time, the grey-robed friars were building a large establishment here, which ran pretty much from the south gate of the city all the way around to the castle. It was pretty huge in the end. And friars had more freedom than monks, and at Oxford they had a very tight link to the university. So it was a natural home as a way of basically not having to worry too much, at least about supporting himself. He also had access to books and was able to spend some time on natural philosophy. And this all seemed to go pretty well until about 1250, when Bacon says that he was sent off to the Mother Convent in Paris, where he spent 10 years on what he calls menial tasks. Now, frankly, all the evidence we do have is that Bacon was pretty outspoken, was not somebody to mince words or suffer fools gladly, and my suspicion is, frankly, he just got on the nerves of everybody around him, and they got rid of him for a bit because he was such a pain. While he was in Paris, however, he didn't just do his menial tasks. He put his mind to calendar reform, and he'd realised, as a number of people were starting to do, that the Julian calendar that was in use at the time was drifting with respect to the seasons. It made the year about 11 minutes too long. And Bacon does a calculation where he works out that it drifts against the seasons by about a day every 125 to 130 years, which isn't a bad calculation given the actual value is 128. And this meant that by that time the calendar had drifted about 10 days against the equinoxes. And you might say, so what? Who cares? Really, it's all artificial. But of course, the date of Easter is calculated from the equinox. And because of that, it meant Easter was being celebrated on the wrong day. And Bacon, I think quite rightly, given the attitudes of the time, felt that this was absolutely horrendous, that they were actually celebrating Easter on the wrong day. And so he made a big push for calendar reform. His ideas were almost identical to the Gregorian calendar that would eventually be adopted in the 1580s originally, and it didn't actually reach England until 1752. So, certainly here he was pushing for something based, in a sense, on mathematics, something that actually did make a difference to them, but frankly something that nobody seemed to care about apart from him. Now, while Bacon was still in Paris, there was a new head of the Franciscan order who essentially moved it away from academic links, banning friars from writing books. Now, Bacon had by this time become obsessed not only with finding out about science, but also with communicating it, and started to look for ways to get around the ban, find a way to be able to communicate. And he found a supporter in the papal legate to England, Cardinal Guy de Fulk. And Bacon basically wrote to de Fulk saying, could I have permission, special permission, to go around the ban and actually write something about science? And Unfortunately, I don't know whether Bacon put it wrong or whether de Fulk misunderstood him or whatever, but basically then Bacon got a letter back saying, sounds great, send me the book now. So essentially the assumption was this book already existed. It did not exist. He was merely asking permission to go around the ban and start writing. So in a bit of a panic, Bacon started looking around to see how he could do something about this. He needed to raise money to be able to do it, and for that matter, he still needed the permission, because de Fulk hadn't actually given him a permission to go around the ban in order to produce the book. Frankly, I think Bacon was still in a bit of a state of panic, although he was collecting information together, when in 1264 de Fulk was summoned to Perugia, where he was told that he'd been elected Pope, and he was crowned the following year, 1265, as Clement IV. So suddenly, Bacon had friends in high places. He actually had the Pope on his side, even if he had this slight misunderstanding in the way. And by 1266, he actually had got formal recognition from Clement that it was okay for him to go around the prohibition and actually start writing, because, you know, the Pope trumps anything your order says. And that was great. So Bacon, early 2067, starts to put together a proposal, a book proposal. And he's a bit enthusiastic. I don't know if you've ever seen a book proposal. There may be 10, 20 pages. I have a copy here of Bacon's initial attempt at a book proposal. It's 500,000 words. Now, I realised that really was a bit on the long side for basically what was supposed to be a letter with a proposal. So he started again and then wrote another 300,000 words. And rather bizarrely and amazingly, he had a third go and again came up with a book instead of a letter. Finally, he did manage a cover letter after he'd written a total of about 1 million words. As I say, communication was something rather special to Roger. So he got this thing together and he sent it off to the Pope. Sorry, I ought to say, yes, that first part of it is usually called the Opus Maius, which is what I've got here. And this was pretty impressive. Although it was supposedly a proposal, it covered optics, astronomy, mechanics, alchemy, agriculture, medicine, and a section on experimental science. And this all seemed very good. It all seemed very effective. So he sent off the first 2 books. The third one was still being copied, because, of course, you know, once he'd written it, somebody else had to copy it out. And the third one was still being copied. But he sent off the first 2 books with a letter to the Pope, assuming now he's going to get the permission to all the money he needs, everything he needs to get this wonderful real book, for which this is just the proposal, written. And off it goes with a man called John to Rome, and everything's looking sunny, when unfortunately the same year the Pope dies, before he ever sees the proposal. And frankly, as far as Bacon was concerned, that was the end of the rise part and the start of the serious fall. Without the support of the Pope, he was still making trouble. He emphasises very much, for instance, that those in the church who wanted just to go for theology, we heard that mention of how Franciscans tried to sort of get around the need for an MA and wanted to go straight to the theology. He basically said that people were idiots who thought they could dismiss things like mathematics and science. It was essential to be able to understand the universe and our place in our relationship with God. And he basically increasingly got up people's noses, and as far as we can tell, I mean, it's only based on a chronicle written in 1370, so it might not be true, but as far as we can tell, Bacon was imprisoned in the 1270s. It suggests he was taken to Ancona in Italy and kept there for about 20 years. So released about 1290. This is, again, based on this later writing. And 2 years later, he died, having written a couple of really miserable and rather nasty bits of writing, when he was obviously pretty twisted as a result of the way he'd been treated. So, an up and down life, but what can we make of what he did? What can we actually do with it? Where does it take us? I thought it'd be quite interesting to see what I could actually discover of Bacon in Oxford now, and how this relates to three ways that Bacon's been treated in history. And the first of those, places I think that's quite interesting in that respect is Folly Bridge. Can I just, out of matter of interest, how many of you here are actually from Oxford? Quick show of hands. Okay, so the majority of you are from Oxford. You'll probably know Folly Bridge then. It's the southern entrance to the city, where the Abingdon Road crosses the Thames. Frankly, now it's a pretty miserable structure, I think it's fair to say, certainly from the road side. It's not that bad from the river, but from the road it's not very exciting. But until 1779, the bridge was spanned by a quite interesting structure. It made it ridiculously impassable, which is why they got rid of it. But it had this structure across the middle that you could just get one cart through the middle of. The sideways picture, incidentally, is Turner's of it. And this was known as Friar Bacon's study. In fact, there's no remnant of this building now, but Pepys wrote in 1668, "So to Friar Bacon's study, I up and saw it and gave the man a shilling. Oxford, mighty fine place." Now, frankly, there's no reason whatsoever to link this building to Bacon other than legend. He was based at the Oxford Friary, which, yes, did extend round as far as Folly Bridge, but there's absolutely no reason to suggest that Bacon would have had such luxurious accommodation. Frankly, most of his time at Oxford, he was not particularly well regarded. Why they'd have given him a good place to hang out like that, I do not know. So I think this is very much down to legend. A legend that began to grow almost as soon as Bacon died. After his death, in fact, he became infamous as a magician, which is kind of ironic because in another of his pieces of writing, a rather nice little thing called the letter concerning the marvellous power of art and nature and concerning the nullity of magic, he specifically goes to great lengths to say that people who claim that they're doing magic are tricksters who are out to get money by fraud, sleight of hand, and using tricks. He's absolutely dead against this whole concept, yet he gets very much identified as a magician. And the mythology grew and grew. So by 1385, we've got the Dalmatian writer Peter of True, a physician, describing Bacon as being able to construct a bridge out of thin air and having a magic mirror in his folly where he could see anywhere in the world if he wished to do so. And there are a host of tales about Bacon's magical powers that came together by Elizabethan times as the famous history of Friar Bacon. I say without added Bongay because this is totally fictional. Friar Bongay, who gets shoved in as a kind of it's sort of Watson to Bacon's Holmes. He's just there to say, "Duh, I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me, please?" And in this famous history, we do meet that brass head that we heard about earlier. This wise automaton had actually been around quite a while, at least the idea of it. It was attributed in the 10th century to the French cleric Gerbert d'Aurillac. Bacon's Bavarian rival, Albertus Magnus, was supposed to have it, and Grosseteste. And interestingly, two Oxford colleges once claimed Bacon as alumni, neither of them do now, which were Merton and Brasenose. Both actually post-date Bacon. Merton was relatively close. Brasenose was way out, wildly anachronistic, 16th century. But the reason that it was said to be the case was that the brazen nose was claimed to be the nose of the head of Bacon's. So we've got a bit of it at Lincoln, a bit of it at Brasenose, but maybe not. So that's Bacon as the legend. That's one, if you like, attribute of Bacon that came to form the way that he was looked at from the future. The second aspect we'll find in the Natural History Museum. Brilliant place. If you don't know Oxford, you must visit it. It's one of the best museums, I think, in the country. And in that Natural History Museum, among the skeletons and other things, there's a set of statues, 28 scientists ranged around the main room. And one of those scientists is Roger Bacon. actually next to Francis Bacon, just to add to the confusion. Now, obviously, we don't have a clue what he looked like. The appearance of him is purely the sculptor's idea, and he's holding this astrolabe, which, according to the museum, represents his scientific studies. And this is Bacon, I suggest to you, in his Victorian guise. The Victorians saw Bacon as a man ahead of his time, a Victorian living in the medieval period, an incredibly far-sighted person. Now, you heard briefly earlier about him talking about cars or whatever, and again, this is out of this marvellous power of art and nature. In it, he lists ships, cars that moved at speed without the help of any living creature, an ornithopter-style flying machine, which actually the only invention he claimed not to have seen. So he actually says the rest of them exist. Complex pulley systems to amplify forces, and diving bells. So some quite interesting speculation there. I wouldn't go as far as science and technology, but speculation. In the same manuscript, incidentally, he does give a formula for gunpowder, which I think is where the rumour, the myth that he invented gunpowder comes from. It is actually not a very good one. There were already better formulas that had come from China, but it is a formula for gunpowder in there. When we talk about his science, though, he was at his best, like Grosseteste, when he was talking about optics. He was fascinated by devices, and although we've heard that the science of the period was very divorced from practical applications and technology, Bacon believed that it was possible to use it in practical ways. And specifically, he said, lenses are contrived so that distant objects appear near to hand and vice versa. We may read the smallest letters at an incredible distance. We may see objects, however small they may be, and we may cause the stars to appear wherever we wish. Now, the first recorded examples of telescopes and microscopes were about 300 years later. It is just vaguely feasible that Bacon had thrown together something that was vaguely telescope-like or vaguely microscope-like. He's certainly describing something that has an interesting parallel, shall we say. He did know a lot about optics. There's no clear evidence, but it is certainly possible that he did construct something. As far as that optics goes, as was common at the time, Bacon still mostly held the ancient Greek view that sight started from the eye. So there was something emanated from the eye that produced sight. But having said that, all he believed that did was to enable light to do its job and enable us to see. And he did very much cover the same kind of optics that had been built up very strongly in the Arabic world. And just an example, that's a modernised version of one of the optical diagrams from one of Bacon's books. So we're talking about relatively sophisticated optical diagrams. And he also describes, don't need to read it, but in sort of some detail, in fact there's a whole book on it that was the first book of the whole encyclopedia he wanted to write, that he gave with the proposal as an example. He wrote about his theory of light, which was something called, rather confusingly for evolutionists, the multiplication of species. And the idea was basically very similar in some ways to the wavelet theory that Huygens would come up with in the 17th century. The idea basically that light affected the medium, the source of light, affected the medium around it. That then generated, if you like, something called a species in the medium, which then generated another species further on. So you effectively got a tiny model of the thing you were looking at propagating through space by a bit of space, affecting another bit of space, affecting another bit of space. So in that sense, he did actually make some interesting steps forward, I think it's fair to say, from the sort of vision that Grosseteste had, optically speaking. When we look over all the things that Bacon did with this Victorian viewpoint, we can certainly see the stress on experiment and maths. As we've heard, experiment did not mean the same thing. He was talking mostly about experience. But having said that, there's a chunk of this book, quite a big chunk, that deals with experimental science. I can't find it now, but there's a reasonable sized chunk of that book purely on experimental science. And he does, when talking about experience, include the idea of things like optical experiments. So it is slightly moved on again from the very traditional idea of experience, pure experience. As we've seen, he actively dismissed magicians. He worked on calendar reform. He worked on things like map projections. In fact, when Columbus wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella asking for support for his voyages, he used a quote from a French cardinal, Pierre d'Ailly, and was unaware that d'Ailly was actually quoting word for word what Bacon said. So actually Columbus used Roger Bacon as an argument, admittedly an incorrect argument, but as an argument for his voyages. Something also I find fascinating as a writer is that Bacon pretty much defined a dictionary as we now know it. Back then dictionaries were word lists, there was nothing else. But he said a dictionary ought to have spelling, pronunciation, derivation and meaning. And it actually wasn't, I think, until around the 18th century before anybody actually started doing dictionaries like that. So certainly you can see why the Victorians thought he was in some ways ahead of his time. But I do want to just finish off with a slight change of viewpoint that came about in the 20th century. And for that I take my third example in Oxford of finding Bacon. This isn't actually it, this is just on the way to it. I did pass a little lane called Roger Bacon Lane behind a gym in a rather not exciting area. But I was on the way to see something much more interesting, which is Oxford's magnificent way of celebrating the life of Bacon. And essentially what we have here is, I'll come back to why it's not here anymore in a moment, but we have here a car park, and on the side of the car park, you can't quite see it, the tree, there's a plaque. And that's it. That's Oxford's magnificent celebration of Bacon. When you get in a little bit closer, that plaque reads, "The great philosopher Roger Bacon, known as the wonderful doctor, who by the experimental method extended marvellously the realm of science, after a long life of untiring activity near this place in the home of his Franciscan brethren, fell asleep in Christ, AD 1292. Apparently that was first erected in King's Terrace in 1917, which was then knocked down. It was then eventually put on the Westgate Shopping Centre, which is where I photographed it there. But unfortunately, as those of you know in Oxford know, there is no Westgate Shopping Centre car park anymore. In November, the plaque was taken down. I don't think it, please correct me if you know otherwise, I don't think it's gone up anywhere yet, but I hope they find somewhere rather better to put it than in a sort of drafty bypass next to a grotty car park. But actually, I do think that sort of whole thing about the difficulty of finding that way reflects the 20th century view. When I was writing about Bacon, I contacted the university, the Bodleian Library, and the Oxford Museum of the History of Science, and each one of them said to me, we don't have anyone with the appropriate expertise to talk about Roger Bacon. Nobody in those three major institutions could put forward anybody to talk about Roger Bacon. And that, I suggest to you, is because the 20th century reaction to the Victorian idolisation was a sort of backlash that said, no, absolute rubbish, Bacon contributed nothing, these medieval scientists contributed nothing. All he was a failed encyclopedist. And I think personally that they are really throwing the baby out with the bathwater there, which is why I wrote that book with that irritating title, which I probably wouldn't do anymore, but hey, I was young. And that he did have some genuinely original thought on things like calendar reform, on the way that he talked about magic being a fraud, on his attitudes to light, and most importantly, I suspect, just because of the sheer volume that survived, that he gave us a unique picture of the ideas of physics and science in general in this period in Oxford and in fact in the Western world. So personally speaking, I think we need to bring Bacon back up, not all the way to the Victorian wonder, but certainly well below the totally dismissed approach that was taken to him in the 1960s. I think he is worth more than that. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that's interesting.
Thank you very much. We've got 15 minutes, I believe. It's 15 minutes past his lunch. So, I'm going to...
Thank you very, very much indeed. I fully agree with what you say about Bacon's significance. I just have a rather amusing tale to tell about Bacon in modern Oxford. And some years ago, the now sadly late Henry Chadwick, Dean of Christ Church, who was a great, great raconteur, said to me, do you know, recently I received a letter that someone had sent to Friar Bacon at Oxford. And someone in Oxford Post Office wrote across it, send it to Dr. Chadwick at Christ Church.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
You mentioned gunpowder, either with that or with anything else. Is there a motivation from or a link to military applications that you think he had in mind?
He certainly does describe that possibility, yes. I mean, basically, in this book, he actually uses gunpowder. When I mentioned about communication but not communicating to other than the wise, he shows you different ways you can communicate things but keep them a bit secret. So different ways of saying something which hides it, and he uses the formula of gunpowder as the example of the way to do this. And when he talks about gunpowder, where I think it's fair to say in Chinese use it was primarily used in fireworks, he specifically does talk about making use of it to make loud noises to scare people during military events. I don't think he actually suggests that he's using it for propulsion, but I think he might mention it being able to knock stones off each other or something to that effect. So the principle is kind of there, yeah, but he's more interested when he's talking about it in the source that I think gets him his reputation for having invented it, as I say, of showing you how you can hide the formula in various different ways from prying eyes who shouldn't know better.
I was thinking that it was Bacon who died of stuffing a chicken rather than the Prime Minister who didn't die of stuffing bacon. But I think I'm wrong. Well, that was Francis, wasn't it?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't Roger.
Okay. I thought
yes, I think it was Francis.
So look, the point, the main thesis of the conference that Oxford develops mathematics and mathematisation and experimental observation. You're pitching, as I understand it, for experimental observation. And you claim that he, in optics in particular, he went beyond Grosseteste in the method. The question there, did he go beyond Arabic optics experimental observation? That's one question. My second question, looking for a scientific contribution, is, were you saying that he had a wave theory of light in effect?
Okay, no, is a simple answer to that. Basically, in terms of optics, I'd say his optical diagrams and that kind of thing don't really move on hugely beyond Arabic science, where they were developed incredibly powerfully. He did have some information that seems to be based on experiment because it doesn't seem to have been reproduced earlier. At the moment, my brain is going blank on what it is. There's some optical information that's in here that doesn't seem to have a previous source. So it does seem to have done optical experiments and produced some detail. Where he was probably most leading was in this theory of the multiplication of species, which actually is almost more like quantum electrodynamics in the sense that it's really a theory of the interaction of light and matter. And as such, it sort of goes beyond just how light moves around. He wasn't talking about waves, as I say, he was actually talking about the idea that effectively a lit object, as it were, produced an image of itself that then multiplied, that went on from place to place. But that was a bit like the wavelets that Huygens used, which basically had a little wave that caused another wave that caused another wave, which is how he imagined light progressed. So it was related, but he didn't actually mention waves in doing that. As far as the maths go, I don't think Bacon was much of a mathematician himself, but over and over again he stresses how important mathematics, and that includes obviously optics and geometry, is in the understanding of the universe and how you can't do science, you can't understand the universe without mathematics. But as I say, to me, it's the combination of that plus his remarkable urge to communicate to the right people that makes him important. And obviously just the fact that we have this material on a scale that we don't have for most of his contemporaries.
Hello. I wondered if you could say something about the dissemination of Bacon's theories into the Renaissance, particularly his optical theories, because I'm wondering how much of an influence we can see in Alberti and Leonardo da Vinci, particularly in theories of aerial perspective.
Yeah, my suspicion is that people like Da Vinci, Brunelleschi or whatever who were dealing with perspective didn't actually derive anything specifically from Bacon. The trouble is, although his writing survived, it was relatively not well circulated to start with. It was actually the rumours, as it were, the myths that spread incredibly powerfully. And to start with, the actual writing was relatively confined, although we do know specifically that this thing got to Columbus via Piero di Ali, i.e. more on the geographical side actually than on the optical side. But no, my suspicion is there would not have been a huge amount of influence on the Renaissance, just as, for instance, his very early suggestions for calendar reform were totally ignored. They had to start all over again, effectively.
I can add a footnote to that. The work that was much known, used by Alberti, used by Leonardo, was Beckham's Perspectiva Communis, which was much more accessible work, but Leonardo had Bacon in his library. Okay. And Alberti studied at Padua and really knew that optical tradition, the medieval optical tradition pretty well, and via it Ibn al-Haytham, and Leonardo later in his life had access in some way to Ibn al-Haytham because there are experimental tests on vision which he conducts, which I think are only in Ibn al-Haytham, Alhazen, and not available in Peckham and Bacon.
Okay, thank you. I bow to that knowledge. So I think we go on one at the front. There's one.
I suppose what was always confused me about Roger Bacon is why him? Of all the philosophers and proto-scientists of the Middle Ages, he's the one who has become the most famous. And although, as you've explained, he produced some interesting work, he's probably not the most significant philosopher of the Middle Ages by a long way. I've done a fair bit of work on 16th century science, and if you ever want to read a 16th century maths or science textbook, they are full of Roger Bacon. Indeed, in one of Roger Record's books, a 16th century mathematician, he talks about Roger Bacon's telescope-like thing, but actually it looks like Record is talking about a real telescope produced by Leonard Digges. And so you have this rather bizarre image of a 16th century writer attributing a legendary device to Roger Bacon, where that device was actually produced just down the road from him quite recently. Yep. But I wonder, what is your opinion about why it is that Roger Bacon has acquired this fantastic reputation, which otherwise, as you just said, can't be explained by his writings?
Yeah, I think there are two things really. There's the sheer volume of his output. This has survived. We just have, and so literally, we've got 1 million words in just the Otis, Magnus, Minus, and Tertius. But also, you really can't underplay the importance of the legend. Just as an example, there's a document that John Dee is said to have acquired, the Elizabethan astrologer, and who had a huge library, and this book Dee ascribes to Bacon for no reason whatsoever than the fact that it is really weird and hard to understand. In fact, we still don't understand it, and it's probably a fake. But the fact is, that Bacon was seen as something remarkably special, I think, mostly because of the legend, but then they could back it up by the fact you did have the content of output that you probably didn't have from someone like Grosseteste, who was probably just as clever, if not more so, in what he was putting out.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank you for telling us the story about how he became. Basically, he got involved into writing because we tend to forget these days about how scientists were treated back in the day and complain about how we are treated, let's say, these days when we want some funding, etc. I'd like to go back to your point that you mentioned that his proposal for vision went back or reverted back to Plato's idea that light emanates from the eye. And in light of the fact that Alhazen's book on optics, Kitab al-Manazir, which was published 1,000 years ago from last year, which was celebrated last year as the International Year of Light, actually went quite far in terms of developing theory of vision and the anatomy of the eye and how, so he made experiments also. And I think Roger Bacon made the point of somehow opposing that. And I was always curious why he became, how did this happen and what was the story behind that?
Okay, I mean, one point I always try to make in having said that Bacon was at least one of the first scientists is I would expect him to be a really bad scientist if he's one of the first ones. I mean, you hardly expect a brilliant one to be the first at anything, really. The amazing thing is that he can do it at all, a bit like the dog walking on hind legs business. It's not really that he was brilliant, and he had some flaws. One of his flaws was he was overly dependent on authority, and he still took a lot of stuff pretty much on authority from the ancient Greeks. He did disagree with Aristotle on some things, and Plato on some things, but he did take quite a lot from the ancient Greeks. And what he ended up doing was trying to bring the two together. So he wouldn't entirely lose the idea that something from the eye was responsible for sight, but having said that, all his straight line optics, all his diagrams are very much based on this sort of arrow view of light sort of coming towards us, and he saw what was coming from the eye just as something that effectively made it possible, or almost opened a channel that then let the straight line optics light actually do its job through the lenses or whatever and hit you in the eye. So he mixed the two in. He couldn't totally lose the bit from the fire from the eye, as it were, because he was too dependent on the ancient Greeks. But equally, he knew, I suspect from his own experiments, there was an awful lot in what the Arabic science had produced, and so he does a sort of compromise of the two, I think it's fair to say.
Okay, we've got time for two more questions in this one.
Using Bacon as a model, what aspects of medieval natural philosophy would you like to see used to resynthesize contemporary monasticism? And conversely, what aspects of medieval monasticism would you like to see help resynthesize contemporary science?
Okay, I think really in some ways we need our previous speaker as a theologian to contribute that one rather than me. I'm not quite sure I can see any reason for getting anything from medieval monasticism myself, but I mean, I struggle with the question, shall we say?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm the wrong person to ask, I think, that one.
You don't see Roger Bacon's monasticism as at all involved with his ability to make these scientific discoveries or part of his inquiry or anything.
No,
used like a fraction in his personality.
I think it's more a case, as I see it, that he became a friar essentially out of necessity. He wouldn't have done otherwise, and on the whole it got in the way rather than helped, because very shortly afterwards there was this prohibition on writing books, and then an awful lot of his effort was just to try to get around it.
But conversely then, what would you say about natural science affecting religious practice? Religious as a process of trying to integrate ourselves with the world as it is, not necessarily a theological perspective.
Right, and that's the bit where I'm struggling, because I don't really have any sort of expertise on theology or religion, so I can't really comment on that.
Bacon is often quoted as having said, "It's the first duty of a scholar to learn languages," and in the quote you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture, he stresses languages. Which languages did he actually know, and did he, more specifically, did he know Arabic?
I think it's... I will bow to anybody else who has better knowledge of this. I doubt very much he did know Arabic. He would primarily be working in Latin, like most people at the time. I believe he did have reasonable but not brilliant Greek. But I doubt it very much. I think it's more, he was saying that language was important, which is one of the reasons he talks about dictionaries quite a lot. He doesn't just talk about sort of dictionaries in the term I mentioned of the different things you want in a dictionary, but actually talked about interlanguage dictionaries as well to help scholars. So he was very much supportive of that. I think himself, I'm not aware, as I say, other people would know better than me, of him being a particularly great linguist himself.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone have any very quick questions?
We've had quite a lot about the legend of Bacon. Why do you think it is that from all the medieval figures we know of, and Adam Marsh, and Grosseteste, and Dumbleton, and all of these, why do you think it's Bacon who became the iconic medieval legendary figure? From Elizabethan chapbooks to Victorian heroisers, down to you writing his Bible today. What was it about Bacon that captured the imagination for 800 years?
I honestly think it's very difficult to say, apart from anything else, because we know so little about him as a person. You know, one of the dire things about trying to write a biography of Bacon is it's almost all indirect, written 100 years or more later, or frankly, totally made up. So actually pinning that down is very difficult. But as I say, as early as the mid-1300s, people were already starting to spread this legend. There were legends, obviously, about other people as well, like Albertus Magnus, who also had their legends, and probably in continental Europe probably had a stronger legend than Bacon. It's just, I suspect one of the benefits here was he was English. So in terms of the development of the English legend, as it were, it became part of it, that he was this special Englishman. I mean, one of the things in the amazing tale of Friar Bacon is the suggestion that he had the mechanism to build a wall around England to protect it. So probably Donald Trump is one of his supporters as well.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I'll let you go now. That was great talk. Thank you very much. I would first of all point out, I think those two books are probably have the same content.
Yes, it is. The left-hand one's the e-book, the right-hand one's the physical book.
And we're going to go off for lunch now, but thank you very much.